You're listening to A Book at Breakfast with Mark Charlesworth and Chris Newton.
Claire. Always Claire. Claire in the morning, sleepy and crumple-faced. Claire with her arms plunging into the paper-making vat, pulling up the mould and shaking it so and so to meld the fibres. Claire reading, with her hair hanging over the back of the chair, massaging balm into her cracked red hands before bed. Claire's low voice is in my ear often. I hate to be where she is not, when she is not, and yet I am always going, and she cannot follow. That was, of course, from The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffeneggar. So that's the book. What's the breakfast?
Well, I'll take a mouthful of the breakfast. So, last month we were safely ensconced in the Midlands, which is relatively close to home for us. But today, we're being transported across the Atlantic to cold Chicago. And as a comfort blanket, to remind me of home, I brought some Marmite on toast.
I don't know if we should talk about the location we're recording this in, but it feels rather like cold Chicago night today, so
Yeah.
we're method recording.
We are method recording because we're actually in Glasgow. But we brought little heart-shaped tubs of travel Marmite with us. If there are any international listeners, or indeed British listeners, they might be surprised to learn that travel Marmite is a thing. But I think for a lot of us, the thought of leaving home without Marmite is basically unthinkable.
That takes about 50% of at least the British population,
Yeah.
and maybe 0.5% of the rest of the world. I imagine travel Marmite doesn't exist in Chicago. Although sadly, Audrey Niffeneggar doesn't comment on that.
I think we should email her.
Strongly worded email.
Have you ever tried Vegemite?
Yes.
It's disgusting, isn't it?
You can probably tell the
No,
sorrowful tone in my voice.
You can't see his face, but you can probably hear that look. But Marmite is a thing of absolute wonder. It's probably the most comforting thing in the world, actually.
Yes, I think
Marmite
so.
on toast. Do you ever like to drink Marmite?
Yes, I do, yeah.
Oh.
Can you drink Vegemite for an equivalent?
I don't know.
I don't imply anything against Australians here. Maybe they feel the same about Vegemite as we do about Marmite. But
Yeah.
to me, Vegemite kind of tastes like caramel. It's a bit like the filling you get in a Cadbury's caramel bar.
Yeah.
Why would you spread that on toast?
I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah,
Time
enough of the
traveller's
breakfast.
life. Well, I don't know. I'm really enjoying this breakfast. It's a love it or hate it thing. In a strange way, I think this book is a bit polarising. I love it. And my origin story for this book was you telling me that I had to read it. No, this book is good. I think you gave it to me and just said you have to read this book. So how did you discover it?
It's interesting when you say it's polarising, and I like the Marmite analogy of it being love it or hate it.
Didn't even plan that. Serendipity.
Wow. That's why you're paid the big pounds. I feel like there's two of us, and you've made the love it or hate it analogy, and I should hate it, so that we can have a good argument about this. And
we don't want to just sit here
merits.
agreeing.
We don't just want to be effusive in our praise for Audrey
I don't think I've
Niffeneggar.
ever disagreed with you on anything, though.
So,
in 35 years more.
if you're looking for discourse and somebody kind of playing devil's advocate whilst the other one argues against the point, that's not the podcast for you. I also love it, as you've probably gathered by now. My origin story, again, I mentioned my mum in the introduction podcast. And again, it's my mum. There was a little spare room in the house that I lived in with my mum when I was a teenager.
Oh, I love that room, the office. We sat many, many hours in that room listening to Howard Shaw and writing our dreadful novel.
Yes. On the bulky computer with the monitor that went back about 2 foot from the actual screen. And there was a bookshelf in there. A bookshelf that I still have the very same shelving at my dad's house.
Oh, I'd never realised that was the same.
Yes.
It's got doctors on it now.
Yes, it does, yeah. And it travels with me. And unfortunately, when I moved it to my dad's house, I think the books were holding the shelf up rather than the shelf holding the books up. So when I moved out of my dad's, I couldn't bring it with me. But It's happily there, and it's got a nice array of books on it. And I think it still has that copy of The Time Traveller's Wife on it that was in my mum's study,
Wow.
as we shall refer to it. So this little bookshelf in the spare room was a little bit like a portal for me, because my mum had a good knack for picking good books, and I think she probably got a lot of them from a bookshop in Lytham, where she used to work. I don't know if you remember it. It was round the corner from her office, and it was called Placket and Booth.
It's still there.
Is it?
Yeah, yeah.
Right,
Still going
okay.
strong. Yeah.
I mean, I have, well, both of us have written various books over the years, and I think they've stocked some of my books at some points over the years, so I guess it's good to name drop them because they've supported me in the past, so I should be supporting
on the
them.
very rare occasion that I've seen a book that I or we wrote in a shop, it's always next to The Time Traveller's Wife.
Interesting.
Yeah, because Chris Newton, Audrey Niffeneggar. Yeah, because we're on. I like to think that we're on the same level. And there was just something really wonderful about seeing our book next to The Time Traveller's Wife. And then bizarrely, quite recently in Lancaster, Oxfam Books, they were both there on the shelf together. And then I was shocked and appalled to find that somebody bought our book.
And it's not The Time Traveller's Wife.
No, it seemed wrong
God.
for The Time Traveller's Wife to be sitting there all on its own. And I'd just begun rereading it in preparation for this. And I left the house without it by mistake. So the copy I'm holding right now, I bought from £1.49 for the Oxfam Bookshop, and I'm comforted to know that it sat on the shelf for many months, if not years, next to our book. Anyway, enough. But it felt like it was meant to be, because despite the fact that I've always said this is one of my favourite books of all time, I'd only read it once, probably in about 2008. Would it have been when you gave it to me? A long time ago.
I mean, what year was this published? That's
2004. I think it came out in 2003 on a little indie publishers, because I think it was a difficult sell. But then the reviews were so good, it was republished by a larger publishing house in 2004, and that was when it exploded.
Yeah, I guess it came to the UK in 2005, maybe. So it was probably, I guess it's one of those books that had quite a long tailwind behind it. It took several years to take off before it was everywhere, and for a while it was everywhere. I feel like everyone who had a soul read it.
yeah. Even people I know who aren't readers read it.
Right. Okay.
And I think because I think it's so engaging, and that's what I was going to say. I didn't think I had time to reread this, and it's interesting that in all those years I'd never reread it. And I thought, well, I'll flick through. I'll reread the beginning and I'll skim to certain parts. But I got about 80 pages in, and that was the day I left home without it. And I just had to buy a second copy, and I couldn't put it down. I just raced through it, and I sort of fell in love with it all over again. And again, in a different way. Like we talked about Adrian Mole, and this is a very, very different book to Adrian Mole. But that thing of when you revisit a book throughout your life, and it's that the double thing of, on the one hand, you're a slightly different person now, and you see different things in it, and you appreciate it in different ways. But for me, we were just talking actually before we started recording. One thing that I'd forgotten on my reread was that the book is divided into 3 parts. Is it A Man Out of Time, A Drop of Blood in a Bowl of Milk, and part 3, the very, very short section at the end called A Treatise on Longing. And I said that kind of sums up the book. But to me, it's is it a love story? Is it science fiction? Is it both? Is it neither? But for me, it is a story about loss and grief and heartbreak, and I think one of the reasons I never revisited it was because the end hit me so much. Well, not even the end, just the whole final third. And I must admit, what day are we on now? Is it Saturday? Yeah, I finished my second read on Thursday, and just sort of basically cried all afternoon. It's the point where I felt ill.
Oh.
I felt like I needed water with electrolytes in it or something. Like
Audrey,
I was so
what have you done?
dehydrated. And I was talking to someone later on in the day, and they said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm fine." Because I can say, "No, I'm not." I read a sad book and it made me cry all day, and now I feel ill. And I think it's strange. We were again. All the best stuff happens before we press record. Not the breakfast though. We were also just talking slightly more lightheartedly, you're in the process of buying a house at the moment, and I was reminded of you when I was reading it, with the section where Henry and Claire, in sort of real time, as it were, are looking to buy a house, and they keep finding ones that Claire likes, but Henry sort of walks out into the garden and shakes his head, says, "No, no, this isn't the one." And it transpires that he's actually been into the future and seen their future home, and so he's looking for that one that's meant to be. Slurp of tea. But and it got me thinking about when I was buying a house, because I bought a house with my wife,
which isn't me.
Not yet. And as part of, as you know, all the stuff you've got to do, you've got to take out various policies and whatnot, and we had to take out a life insurance policy, and it's just one of the things that a lot of banks won't lend you a mortgage if you haven't got a life insurance policy. And it's funny, all the sort of little bureaucratic things you have to do, like you take out car insurance and you hope that you won't be in an accident, and you think, well, and if I am, it'll just be a little bump and everyone will be okay, and you hope that no one will steal your car or set it on fire. And when you take out contents insurance for your house, you think, well, I hope no one will burgle me, I hope the house won't burn down, but even if it does, we'll be all right. But when you take out life insurance and you have to read, and I don't know how it compares if you're buying a house on your own, but when you're buying a house as a couple, there's a lot of bureaucratic stuff you have to go through about what happens when one of you dies, and it's not if, it's when. And that was a hard week for me, dealing with that paperwork, and I tried not to engage with it as best as possible, just to see it as a necessary bureaucratic thing, just a form to sign. But really, you're reading about terminal illness and terminal diagnosis, and what happens if one of you can't work, and then what happens when one of you dies, and it was just that thing. This isn't hoping you won't crash your car, this isn't hoping that the roof won't fall in, this is when one of you dies. Because if you're in a relationship or a friendship, one of you will die first and the other will be alone. And to me, that's the heart of The Time Traveller's Wife. Now, if you've listened to this podcast before, you should know that spoilers, full spoilers. We anticipate that people have read the books that we're talking about, because they're generally well known and have been around for a while. So, as you may have guessed from what I've just said, not everybody gets out of this book alive. But that's not a massive spoiler in a sense, because it's the story of Henry and Claire's lives, and lives end. But that said, don't listen any further unless you've read The Time Traveller's Wife.
I think Henry realises relatively early on in the book that he's not going to make it past the age of
43.
Is it 43?
Yeah.
Right, okay. And to live with that certainty... And I haven't reread it recently, the same as you, because I'm busy buying a house. So I'm kind of going off memory here, and with a little bit of help from my good friend Wikipedia. But obviously there are lots of things I remember about this book, because it had such a huge impact on me at the time. And this was a book for me that I wanted to live with the characters, and I didn't want to read it quickly. I was kind of almost putting off reading bits of it, and I didn't want to leave their world. And I think when people would probably say that we're both quite sensitive. I mean, you've just said that you kind of cried yourself to dehydration when you finished this book. I have to struggle when I'm reading particularly a lengthy book, or maybe a series of books, or the same with films and TV series, when the characters kind of become part of your world,
and then you have to let them go.
Yes, they become like a extended family. So I was putting that off, and I can't for a moment say that I felt anywhere near the same amount of pain as Claire having to let Henry go, or Henry having to know that he would have to let Claire go, because their love is a true love. I don't think anyone has written about love so as well as Audrey Niffeneggar. I can't think of many love stories as kind of profound and deep or true as this.
No, that's a good point. I'm struggling myself now.
I feel like we feel the kind of pain of their impending loss throughout the book, and even before it's kind of announced, you kind of know it's going to happen.
Well, I'm trying to remember, to cast my mind back to when I first read it. It's interesting that you should say we know that Henry is going to die at 43. And there is a point about a third of the way into the book where he says, yes, we know he's going to die at 43. But there's a bit earlier on where he says, well, I know I live to at least 43 because that's the oldest he's ever seen himself, because obviously he's unstuck in time and occasionally meets his older or younger self. And but I think when I first read it, because there's a whole subplot with Dr. Kendrick. I always say, well, I want to say Hendrick because of Hendrick from Children of the Stones, sinister time travel scientists.
I always picture that Hendrick. So.
Oh, do you?
Yeah. But with mice.
Of course, yeah. Well, poor time traveling mice.
I know.
I've forgotten what I was saying now. The subplot with the Doctor and the potential that she dangles, that there could be a cure or a preventative. And so you think, well, I remember first time round, well, if he's not seen himself over the age of 43, maybe at 43 they find a cure for it. But no.
So we are into serious spoiler territory here. So please, if you haven't read the book and you haven't already switched off, go and read the book in about 5 days by Chris standards, or 5 weeks by me standards. Come back and listen to it then.
But stock up on electrolytes.
Yes, indeed. Did you have any kind of inkling when Henry is at Claire's family's and her father and her brother are whispering?
Oh my God, that scene. No, that's so well written. Because it just has such an atmosphere of dread, real foreboding dread. And especially because Claire's quite young when she witnesses it. And, there's almost like, there's a childishness to her reaction to it. It's that I know something has happened, something bad. And it's so weird because there's one version of Henry already there. So you think, oh, it can't be anything to do with Henry because he stood there and he's fine. But of course there are two Henrys there and he's not fine. So I think the point where you absolutely know he's going to die is when the future version rings them from the parking lot.
Oh yeah.
And then they go to find him and he's not there and you think, and you just know. But what struck me reading back was how much foreshadowing there was about not only his death, but the fact that he loses his feet.
Oh God.
Which it just seemed to come out of no. I mean, it didn't, because he always arrives naked and he lives in Chicago. I've never been to Chicago, but it makes me think of the Blues Brothers which other film is famous? Oh, Planes, Trains and Automobiles. But Snow. I always wonder why they didn't just live somewhere warmer. But
probably because Audrey Niffeneggar never lived somewhere.
No, maybe.
And I suppose Chicago is as much the character to her because she knows and loves it.
Very much so, yeah.
From what I've read about it, I think it is a very Chicago book because Chicago has quite a thriving art scene. And their lives are so informed by art,
massively,
and poetry,
and on the one hand, when I read that as a young man, when I was in my early 20s, I thought they were very cool, and I loved how sort of bohemian they were. Reading that at 35, I thought I found myself turning my nose up at them a little bit more. And with Claire with her trust fund, and yet I think it's quite skillfully done. What they're interested in culturally, because it makes it kind of timeless. I was shocked rereading it because I just absorbed it so much first time around. I never really stopped to think about when it was set because it bounces around in time so much. You think a lot about their ages, but not so much the age that they're in. And I realised that so much of it's set in the 90s, and I love anything set in the 90s, but you don't really get. There's a reference to the Millennium Bug on New Year's Eve *99. There's obviously a reference to 9/11. But because Henry doesn't watch TV because it makes him time travel because of the flickering images, almost like a seizure or whatever. But the fact that they're into sort of literature and poetry, and his parents are classical musicians, and Claire's into a sculpture. There's something oddly timeless about their lives and their references that I thought worked really well. It doesn't jar. But sorry,
it's a time between, it's almost entirely before mobile phones and the internet as well.
Yes.
Which, in a strange way, anything kind of post about 2003, 2004, when everyone got a mobile phone.
Yeah.
There is something that seems almost dated about that now.
Very much so.
And references to technology can date things very quickly, and it just about escapes that trap.
So well done. And something that struck me again, I'm really nervous to talk about this because I don't believe that that everybody has read it. I can't emphasize enough how much you must stop listening to this if you haven't read the book.
That's your third warning now. 3 strikes and you're out.
We'll just go back in time and stop them from listening to the podcast.
Yeah.
Although, then the event which caused us to go back in time would never have happened.
Oh, so we're in a paradox, yeah.
But the very final chapter of this book, Always Again, when Henry is 43 and Claire is 82, and it again, you just think about the ages. We'll come back to this chapter later, the contents of it, but it's set in 2053. And rereading it, I thought it was so clever. You know, an old woman sits on a table facing the window, a teacup sits at her elbow. Outside is the lake, the waves rush up to the shore and recede. And then I think they talk about... oh yeah, there we go. Everything is clean. The storm has left branches strewn around the yard, which I will presently go out and pick up. All the beach's sand has been redistributed. They're talking about nature and the seasons, and she's drinking a cup of tea, but there's no reference to any kind of technology or... So this could be in some far-flung digital future. Or it could be post-apocalyptic. You know, she could be the last remaining human on a hut in a beach looking at the devastation of this. And it's so clever because nothing dates something more than a shit image of the future. You know, you watch 70s and 80s sci-fi programs where the technology of the year, 3052 is basically like a BBC computer with floppy disks.
Are you laying into the Jetsons?
No, sorry. I said we'd never disagreed about anything. Here we go. But back to what I was saying about the amount of foreshadowing. And there's a bit relatively early on where he's talking about Henry goes for a run basically every morning, and even in his perfect scenario where they just lie in bed and have sex all day, he still would have to get up and run every morning. And she says, "Why?" And he says, "Because often my life depends on me being able to run away." And there's a bit where he says, and she said, he says his feet are like leather because he's always running barefoot. The soles of Henry's feet have thick calluses, as though they are trying to become shoes. I am a beast of the hoof. If anything ever happens to my feet, you may as well shoot me. And because that doesn't register first time, but it should, because and also there's a bit where she first goes back to his house. She looks at the books on his shelf, and I was thinking sort of artistically, I was like, oh yeah, there's the annotated Alice, Impossible Things and Songs of Innocence and Experience. But also on Henry's bookshelf is a book called Hypothermia, Frostbite and Other Cold Injuries. Like, he always knew, I think, what could happen and almost certainly would happen eventually. And what I found interesting again on the reread is that his dad was a violinist and quite a successful violinist, but he's an alcoholic, and eventually his hands are shaking so bad he can't play a violin anymore. And I'm not sure what page, I don't have the quote to hand, but he basically says, "That's it, my hands are gone, I've got nothing now." And there's a weird parallel there with what happens to Henry.
Yeah, it's bringing back those kind of feelings of how horrifying it is reading it, and how everything Henry loves and that defines him is gradually taken away bit by bit. And I guess it's easy to focus on Henry's loss, but maybe we should talk a little bit about Claire as well.
Well, that's
because she spends so much of the book sitting around waiting for him,
yes,
and she's kind of defined by worrying about him and never quite knowing where he is and how unbearable that must be, and then waiting for a child as well, and then spending her teenage years not dating anyone because she's waiting for him to come along, and spending her middle age to her old age waiting for him to make his final appearance. So who suffers more in this book?
Both of them?
I don't know.
Yeah, they both suffer more. Time is relative, and there's an interesting point where Henry is speculating as to how old he is because of all, he's about I'm 35 or whatever in real time. So, but the amount of time I've spent in the past, those extra days, he said, I'm probably much older. So, and yet, so if he's lived longer, technically, has he suffered more? But the hours and the days that she waits must stretch on for eternity. But yeah, it's really interesting that the book is called The Time Traveller's Wife. Like she is the titular protagonist. She is the wife, and yet she's the time traveller's wife, and she, as a woman, is defined by her husband. And so there's that whole. And I think when I said this book is polarizing, I think what a lot of people, especially with a slightly more, it's odd for me not to think of this as a modern book. I think of it, it's just come out, but it's nearly 20 years old now. Sort of viewed through a modern lens, I think a lot of people see a darkness in it, and there is a darkness in it, but an almost sort of toxic darkness on Henry's part, in the fact that the way he molds her almost,
or grooms, as the modern vernacular would have it,
and like we mentioned, their tastes in art, for example, and I think it was in the Audrey Niffeneggar on the Book Club podcast. I think somebody asked her, and somebody was saying she's only an intellectual because he made her an intellectual. But even that becomes paradoxical, and if you view it that way, it is. There's one bit in particular where she's talking about she wants to cut her hair because it's too much, so much work, like washing it and combing it, and but I know how much Henry loves me with my long hair, and on the one hand, like, is that sweet, or is he possessive, is he controlling? But then love is sort of possessive and controlling, and at what point is it a force, not a positive force? And you know what, in the Adrian Mole episode, and I hope this becomes a regular segment in these episodes, a little grandmother appreciation segment. And in light of what you were talking about, I think it's really interesting. There's a good grandmother character in this story. I feel like there are two good grandmother characters in this story. There's Mrs. Kim, or Kimmy, Henry's Korean. Now, she isn't his auntie, but she, for all intents and purposes, I think she's sort of domestic staff for his father. I think
so, yeah.
But because his mum died when he was really young, she is effectively his mother figure, and like taking Claire to meet her is a big deal. And even when he's older, she's still, will kick his arse and give him a good talking to. But I also really like the character of Claire's grandmother. And there's the scene where towards the end of her life, her eyesight's going, and she's the only member of Claire's family that meets Henry. Before Henry and Claire officially meet, or really meet, or chronologically meet. Claire is 17, Henry is 40. There we go, on the 8th of April 1989, and it's interesting because she introduces him to her grandmother as her boyfriend, and there's a bit where she touches his face and says, "That's sandpaper, you're not a boy." I could have missed it, but I don't actually remember the bit where Claire or Henry tells her that he's a time traveller, but she seems to pick it up. But it's interesting at first. It's funny because he knows he's about to disappear and go back to the present, but he says, "I'm afraid I've got a train to catch," and she says, "Just a moment, young man." And then she thinks it's a bit rude because he's gone, but then I think she realises he's disappeared, and she says, "But Claire," says my grandmother, "he must be a demon." And I thought, wow. and then she says, "But Henry's good. He doesn't feel like a demon." And then Grandma smiles. "Don't you think a real demon would be sort of demonic?" And then the grandmother says, "I think he would be as nice as pie if he wanted to be." Right, yeah, astute and quite sinister. But then but she seems to twig somehow that he's a time traveller, but there's a really interesting bit as part of their conversation. In terms of what you were saying about how it's Claire's always waiting, and she's saying that Henry's a time traveller and he's not a demon, but she says you might be right that he's not quite human, because in the future Dr. Kendrick thinks that he's the next step in human evolution, and we know that in the future there are more what they call chronologically displaced people, but she says that it would be quite exciting to marry a person, but the grandmother says, "Think of the children popping into next week and back before breakfast." And Claire says, bear in mind she's still only 17 at this point, "Well, that will be exciting, like Mary Poppins or Peter Pan." And I thought this was a really astute observation when the grandmother says, "Think for a minute, darling. In fairy tales, it's always the children who have the fine adventures. the mothers have to stay at home and wait for the children to fly in through the window. And so she's just summed up basically all of Henry and Claire's adult relationship.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'd completely forgotten that scene.
I had too. It's, there's so much going on in and around that that it just seems like a small moment, but it's one of the, on the reread, things just leap out at you and you think, yeah, that's got to the heart of it.
I'm surprised I didn't retain the grandmother moment, because I usually do in books. It's usually
I know, I'm surprised.
a key section of them to me.
But, and again, in terms of sort of reading it when I was younger, and I was very much, because I guess I am a very romantic person and a very sort of fanciful person. And of course, one of the main themes in this book, if not the main theme, and this kind of dictates, I think, to a large degree, whether you see it as a sinister book or a toxic book or and if you believe that they are in love and that they're meant to be, and I kind of swallowed that whole.
Yes,
like,
me too.
I just on my first read, I just accepted without question that these two are meant to be together and they are in love.
To me, I thought it was one of the best love stories ever written, and I think I am quite romantic, but so much so with this book that time travel, if it can be called a genre in its own right, I guess it's part of science fiction, but time travel is something I'm fascinated in, and a lot of the books and TV shows we love involve time travel. And yet, I almost forgot that it had a time travel element, because I just see a time travel as a kind of backdrop to analyse a romance, and the romance took over. And there's a quote from Audrey Niffeneggar where she said, "Time travel was a way to explore a marriage in a cubic sense, to look at it from all angles at once." And to me, if I had to kind of file it in a bookshop when I was younger, I would have filed it in the romance section. And then coming at it later on,
you think, this is science fiction.
It is science fiction, yeah. And in that respect, in terms of trying to pin it to a genre, it makes me think of Donnie Darko, which is a film that we both absolutely love. And it's equally
of time travel.
devastating. Yes, absolutely. They're almost like two sides of the same coin. There's a kind of companion aspect to them.
Yes, yeah. But then it kind of begs the question, what the time travel represents in the book, or if it represents anything. Maybe it is just time travel and we take it at face value. But in terms of the idea of them being soulmates and them being meant to be, there's a wonderful bit where she's just got together with Henry in real time when she's 20 and he's 28, and he's only just met her. But Gomez, her friend Gomez,
he's an interesting character.
he is interesting, and I think I like him, but then sometimes I'm not really quite sure.
I wanted to like him, and then he makes that move on, again, spoilers, on Claire.
We've already spoiled it.
After
Yeah,
Henry's gone.
and it's not...
it kind of... I was uncomfortable with that, and I felt like he was a character that was kind of on the fringes and had a kind of romantic interest, but I felt he could have turned away from that and been redeemed.
And then you find out that she slept with him in the interval between, there were 2 years where she would not see Henry, but she had to wait to meet him in real time. I keep saying real time, but that doesn't feel quite right. What is reality? What is time? But and it's funny, and she keeps that secret for so long, and then when she finally confesses to him, look, before we were together, sort of, I slept with Gomez, and he says, well, I've literally just come back from that day in the past when I told you to go out and experiment while you wait for me, so how could I be angry with you, because I literally told you to do it, and she's so relieved.
I'd forgotten about that. I'm glad he does that, because in my memory, Henry tells Claire that they are going to be together so she doesn't date, whereas Henry doesn't tell himself that. So as a child, so he kind of is allowed to go off and date.
He's very. He does say, I had all these disastrous relationships before I met you because I didn't know I was going to meet you.
Yeah.
But he gives her that, and of course she says she'll wait, but then she can't. And I think she regrets it straight away. But then Gomez, that's the interesting parallel, is that Gomez is then obviously completely in love with her. And even there's a really sad bit that I'd forgotten about where Gomez is his wife and Henry go to the theatre together. Do you remember? And they go for a coffee afterwards, and he realises that it was just an excuse to get him on his own so she can sort of blurt out her anxieties about the fact that she knows her husband is in love with his wife, and it's quite. He says, I know he's just waiting, and he says, well, waiting for what? And she says, something to happen to you because he knows you're gonna something, but you're either gonna die or be arrested, or
What's a horrible position to be in?
Yeah, for her,
yes,
to feel like second best.
Yeah.
But that there, in a strange way, there's a parallel between Gomez and Claire there because he spent his life waiting for her.
Yes.
And then there is that moment after Henry's died where they almost sleep together, and it's just sort of too much for her, and she can't do it. And you sort of, you understand from Claire's perspective. Her husband's been dead 2 years, and she knows she'll see him again at some point. But at the same time, she needs human interaction. She needs something. But Gomez is married at that time with children, and like his wife is out with Claire's children, his children and Claire's child, and it was actually that moment that made me dislike him because he thinks that he would do that to his family. But this is many years before that, so Gomez has seen Henry around town, getting in fights and things. Or he just knows, I've seen that guy around and he's trouble. And he warns, and Claire's not telling him the whole truth, but she says, it's okay, like, we're meant to be together and I love him. And he says, but he's dangerous for you. And she basically says, I don't care. And again, that idea of like true love and fate, or from a time travel perspective, sort of predetermination or predestination. She's trying to explain, I love him. He's my life. I've been waiting for him my whole life, and now he's here. I don't know how to explain. With Henry, I can see everything laid out like a map, past and future, everything at once like an angel. I can reach into him and touch time. He loves me. We're married because we're part of each other. It's happened already, all at once. And, that doesn't make any sense to him. But, and that passage especially, it struck me as an example of the quote from Audrey Niffeneggar about using time travel as a means to explore a relationship, and again, like, what does the time travel represent? What does it mean? And in a strange way, like, there's so much in this book that I found about an almost sort of Zen-like sense of being in the now, but mindfulness and being in the present, because of course, like, that's all there is ever, Well, not if you're a time traveler.
I was going to say for Claire there is.
But in a sense, the past is an abstraction. Well, the past can't be changed, but the future is an abstraction to us non-time travel folk. And all we have is now. It's all that you can affect, but in a strange way for Henry, he never knows when he's going to disappear. So he has to kind of live in the moment, and
he's not controlling this, and I suppose that's something to remember about that.
And that's where you get into this idea of fate, and if you feel these two people have been drawn together by what, divine will, or is it chaos of the universe, whatever, they've been thrust together, and neither of them had any choice in it. And it is like when you fall in love with someone, it does feel like that. It just happens. It just sort of like barges into your life and smashes you over the head, and you get no say in it. But there's a great bit that kind of sums up not just one of the key themes in the book, but Claire's outlook and how she feels about the fact that she's in this possession of always waiting for Henry. And it's when she first meets, or she's recently got to know Henry's dad. And he's very direct. He says, why would someone marry Henry? But then he's very, not embittered as such, but he never got over his wife's death. And there is that unspoken thing of he resents Henry for surviving, and every time he sees his son, he sees his wife in him, and he can't really bear it. But then this, she says, you were lucky. As in, you were lucky to have loved and been married to this person you loved and had a child with them. And he says, well, we were and we weren't. 1 minute we had everything. 1 minute we had everything we could dream of, and the next minute she was in pieces. But then Claire says, don't you think it's better to be extremely happy for a short while, even if you lose it, than to just be okay for your whole life? And that's the question, isn't it? And that's why she waits. But there's a bit as well where when they realise that their daughter can time travel, there's a great observation about that just watching her. I think, is she drawing? I can't quite remember, but she's just savouring the fact that her daughter is here now, and that's kind of all we've got, in a strange sense.
So in a way, it's a parable to appreciate the now.
Yeah, the bit that absolutely destroyed me on first reading and on second, I didn't think it, but so again, rereading it, there are all these signposts that Henry is going to die, and also that he's going to die of frostbite and probably lose his feet. Like, I can't believe I didn't see it first time round. But even that's strange, because you think it's so awful when he wakes up in the hospital after he's had his feet amputated, and you think, and he's so sort of despondent, and then that, you know, and Kimmy comes and like literally bathes him and forces him out of bed into his wheelchair, and you think that's kind of it, but then they adjust to something quite normal and happy, and it's wonderful when he's in the kitchen cooking with them. But even that's tinged with melancholy, because he says, you know, you can't cook, and I will be gone soon, and you need to know how to cook. So and like the scene where he's crawling around the living room, and their daughter's like riding him like, like a horse, and it's oddly sweet, and they adapt, and they. But anyway, I digress. What were we actually talking about? So I didn't know for certain on first read that Henry was going to die. And then there's that moment where he travels into the future, into the year 2011, which kind of blew my mind rereading it, because of course, not only was that in the future when it was written, that was in the future when I read it. And it's quite astute, because their daughter has a cell phone. And by 2011, we pretty much all did have mobiles. And there's that awful kind of, you know, penny dropping gut punch moment where Alba says, "Oh, daddy," and then the school teacher says, "Who are you?" And she said, "This is my dad." And she said, "No, Alba's father's dead." And you realise, oh God, he's only got maybe less than 10 years left to live. But it wasn't that. That was a shock. But then the bit where she rings Claire, says, "Daddy's here."
Oh my God!
And she's like, "I'm on my way."
She's rushing to get to the museum.
And it just absolutely broke me.
Yes.
And imagine that. And I don't know why, because it reminded me, funny enough, there's a scene, there's a Doctor Who episode called Tooth and Claw.
Is there now?
Having
not watched Doctor Who.
Oh, it's quite good. I think you'll like it. Well, more on that later. Where Queen Victoria is talking about why we love ghost stories. You know, it's not really about the fright. You know, she was famously in mourning herself, and she says it's about the fantasy that there is something after death, and that we will be real. And in that sense, you know, this is a fantasy novel, and the fantasy is that we can meet again after death, and we can exist throughout time, and not just be enslaved to one moment. And I thought this shouldn't be such an awfully sad moment, because it's a happy moment, because her husband is dead, but then here he is, and she can go and see him again. But the desperation of it. Imagine that, you know, she just drops whatever she's doing and comes, and she gets to him just before he vanishes, and he gets to tell her, "I love you" again. And I thought, you know, this is all of us. This is now. If you love someone, one day they will be dead, or you will be dead, and you will never see them again. And imagine if you could time travel back to a time and place where you were both alive and you both loved each other. That's today. That's now. So if you love someone, what are you doing? Just go and be with them, and grab them and hold them and tell them that you love them.
That's really quite wonderful, and I feel really quite moved by that. So
now I have a question for you. And I tell you what, again, it's funny reading this quite a lot older than I was when I first read it. That I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I remember thinking, Henry lived till 43, and I'm thinking, well, at least he had a good long life before he died. And now I think, my God, he died so young. And Claire, of course, is only 35 when he dies. And I say optimistically, as a 35-year-old, that she still has her whole life ahead of her. And they're both kind of, you know, like, people have talked about the sort of the darker or the more problematic elements of it, like, is Henry inappropriate to Claire and all that. And I know that Audrey has said, well, he had no choice. And you think of it very much through Claire's timeline, but again, just to see both sides. From Henry's point of view, he didn't know who she was, and she just appeared to him one day and said, "I am your future wife." And neither of them had any control over it or say in it. And you almost wonder, the bit I quoted earlier where she's talking to Gomez saying, "I just know that we're meant to be together." It's almost like, in a strange sense, you could read it like Monica in Friends, like ever since she was little, having a pillow slip on her head and pretending it was a bride's. But you know what I mean? That I want this perfect husband, and we do. We put our significant others on pedestals sometimes, and I think that was one of the really interesting things about it, was that when 20-year-old Claire meets 28-year-old Henry, he isn't the person that she knows.
No.
And I think there are times when she's a bit disappointed by him.
Oh,
and
interesting.
she's sort of waiting for him to become the person that she knows he is. But then you wonder, to what extent does she mould him into being that person?
Yes. And
But
on their first date, she's kind of teasing him as
Yeah.
well, making fun of him, because she has the upper hand in that situation, which isn't something I think happens a lot throughout the book.
No, and it's nice for her to have that moment, the rare moments where Claire knows more than Henry does.
Yeah.
But there is one, because of course she doesn't even know what his surname is till she first meets him, because he's like, we can't mess up the timelines and whatnot, and we can't risk anything. But he gives her one clue. He doesn't tell her what his name is or where he lives or what he does for a job, but he says Chicago, and then she makes it a whole purpose over those 2 years to go to school, university or whatever it is in America, and get to Chicago. And you think, what if he hadn't said that one word? Would they've never met? But then it's like, pulp, something changed.
Yes. And I'm not surprised she made it a purpose. She must have been so desperate and frustrated. You remember what it's like being a teenager when everyone around you seems to be coupling up. Not that I'm saying we were last to be picked for the school dance or football teams. Anyway, you said you had a question.
Oh, yes. So, thank you. So Claire's 35, and then after he's died, Henry leaves her a letter. In fact, I will just find a bit of that letter now, just because it's so incredibly beautiful. And this is, the bit where Claire's talking to Gomez about, we're just meant to be together, and that's how it is. Henry has a similar moment in the letter when he says, oh God. So she's reading this, a letter to be opened in the event of my death. It's, Claire, I want to tell you again, I love you. Our love has been the thread through the labyrinth, the net under the high wire walker, the only real thing in this strange life of mine that I could ever trust. Tonight, I feel my love for you has more density in this world than I do myself, as though it could linger on after me and surround you, keep you, hold you. But that said, in terms of them having no control over it and being thrust together, now he does tell her, I've hesitated whether to tell you this, but we will meet again in, what was it, 2053, when she is 82? 82. Yeah.
Okay.
And does she have a choice there? Do you think that Claire, I mean, we know from snippets after that she probably, I know she's got Alba in her life still, and the heartbreak of knowing that Alba will periodically see Henry and she won't. And there's that wonderful bit right at the end where we get a snippet of 25-year-old Henry meeting Alba, and she says, I'm looking for my daddy, but I've come too early. And Ingrid gets it. She says, you are awfully dense sometimes, and Henry hasn't twigged who she is, and it's so sad. But yeah, at this point she knows she's going to see him again, but does she move on, do you think? Or I don't think she does, because she alludes to in that very final chapter the fact that she's been. In fact, she even says in her own words that she has no choice. Is that I know Henry will come eventually. I sometimes wonder if this readiness, this expectation, prevents the miracle from happening. But I have no choice. He is coming, and I am here. And again, just what a final sentence. Well, what a final sentiment to leave the book on. I am here. Just reiterating that idea of like just be here now, just being in the moment. And but she says she has no choice. But does she mean that she doesn't want anything else? Like, is she still beholden to whatever cosmic force or divine intervention or whatever you want to call it, or is it choice?
I think, well, you can look at it both ways. You can think that Henry is almost maybe a little bit cruel telling her that, and maybe if you were reading it in a cynical way, you could think there's a possessiveness about it, that he doesn't want her to be with anyone else, and almost leaves this control over her life after she's gone. And in that letter you read an excerpt of earlier, you could almost see that he is kind of saying, I'm surrounding you with my love, and almost at the expense of anyone else's. And he doesn't explicitly say, you know, experiment, fool around, move on, like he does when she's a teenager and she's waiting for him. But I believe that Audrey Niffeneggar is writing a book about true love.
Yes.
And
that's
I think
my interpretation
because
too.
she believes that these characters are the personification and the absolute vehicle of true love, I don't think that's how it was intended. I think it's easy for a
definitely not how
cynical
it was
modern
intended.
audience to read it like that, and maybe there is some unconscious bias in Audrey Niffeneggar that's written it that way, but certainly not her intention. I don't think. I think it would be impossible for Claire to move on because she loves Henry.
Yeah.
And her whole life has been Henry and will be Henry, even if that just involves one more moment.
And then we're back to her observation earlier on with Henry's father about it's worth it for one moment of happiness. And she knows before she dies she will have her one moment of happiness. And that's all any of us can hope for, really, isn't it? But then there's the, you know, a lot of people pick up on the inappropriate nature of the idea that, you know, he effectively... 36-year-old Henry has a relationship with like 6-year-old. I don't mean a relationship in a romantic or sexual sense, but they know each other.
Well, I think she's quite careful about. I mean, Audrey
Niffeneggar
is very careful about the way she writes it.
Yeah, but I think a lot of people just kind of take that at face value and think, God, this is horrendously inappropriate. And there is an argument for that. But I think it's a fantasy time travel science fiction novel. And I mean fantasy in the fantastical sense. And again, there was a great quote by Audrey Niffeneggar, I think again in the book club podcast, where she basically said, I can't remember her exact words, but she said it was so bizarre. The events of this book, the scenario, the premise of The Time Traveler's Wife is so bizarre that it cannot have any real world comparison. But again, it depends how literally you want to take the time travel element.
I suppose a lot of people find it easy to problematise that aspect of it because of the nudity, because he doesn't take his clothes off, so he's appearing naked. The 6-year-old girl who will want to have a
horrible
relationship
visual,
with him. But when you hear Audrey Niffeneggar talk about that,
it's very mechanical. Like if it's a genetic condition, then it only affects you physically. You can't time travel. Terminator rules.
Exactly, yeah, and also. It's kind of almost seen through the lens of Claire as a child, and a child doesn't perceive nudity as sexual.
No,
to them it's just innocent. I don't think she sees anything where she's kind of.
You know, there's a bit right at the end where, again, it's sort of heartbreaking, but he's towards the end of his life, he's telling Alba a bedtime story, and it's the story of his life.
Yeah,
and he says, one day he would just appear in this meadow, and Alba says, with no clothes on, and he giggles. To her, it's a funny thing, you know. But it is like, if you kind of take it at face value, it's kind of a bit uncomfortable. And yet I think, you know, when you people are like Russian dolls, and you're not a child and then you're an adult and then you're you know what I mean? Like, I think, and I very much feel like inside I'm still a 6-year-old boy, and yet there's just more of you, more layers as you go on. And I think when you know somebody really well, whether it's a romantic relationship or like us, like. You know, I think when we're together, especially because we've been friends since we were 8, on some level we're still 8 years old and still like living in make-believe worlds. I agree. And there is, I think, most people, you only see the outer layer of the Russian doll, but when you know someone really well, if they're a close friend or family or a spouse, like you can see every part of them, and you kind of and I suppose what I'm saying is, like, if you take it in an abstract way, you can know somebody and know all their childish traits and qualities, and it's almost like the vulnerability of, because we are, you know, I don't want to get too detailed about it. I've had some therapy, and it was really interesting talking about like how you respond to things as a child. Basically, you certain reactions are hardwired, and even though you know you can cope with things as an adult, your initial response to a situation is the 6-year-old part of your brain going, I can't cope with this. I don't know how to fill out this form, or start my car, or fix this broken roof. That kind of thing.
Apply for life insurance.
Right, exactly. And there's a vulnerability in kind of letting somebody see that beyond the top layer of your Russian doll. And when you have a close relationship with somebody, they see you at your most childish and vulnerable. And again, it is weird, but it's just a sort of a mechanical, in terms of the plot device. Like, he has to be naked when he time travels, because how else would it work? But that on a metaphorical level, like when you're married to somebody, it's like you are naked and completely vulnerable, and they nourish you and they clothe you and they bring you food and warmth. And I very much interpreted it on an abstract level.
And also, Henry is vulnerable in those situations.
Yeah.
When he turns up in any situation when he time travels,
and
he is at his most vulnerable. So he is not in a position of power in that dynamic.
And
with
that's
Claire as a child.
Ultimately, fatally vulnerable. I'm aware that time is running on. Although I would, one final observation in that, again, the time travel, I always think that, because despite everything I said about the importance of sort of living in the moment and just being, and so I mentioned Be Here Now, of all things, that last chapter where I said she really skillfully just talks about the earth and the seasons, and doesn't give anything that would date it if we're still alive in 2053. I doubt I'll read that and say people don't drink tea and wear cardigans anymore. Although you never know. They say that tea drinking is on the decline in this fair land. So we'll have to do something about that.
Yes.
But I remember Noel Gallagher saying, someone asked him how to write hit songs. He said, just sing about the weather. He said, because it'll never date. If you sing about the sunshine, people will always want it to be sunny, and it'll never be dated, and everyone will be able to relate. And there's a kind of,
very wise.
He was being flippant, but actually there's some truth in that.
Yes.
Anyway, but despite everything about being in the moment, I sort of feel like we as humans are time travelers in the way that animals aren't. Like dogs, very much we're going for a walk, I'm eating a thing. But whereas we constantly dwell on the past and we constantly think about the future.
We certainly do.
Well, we do, yeah. And there's a lot, and we're kind of running out of time now. But in Henry, Henry talks to Dr. Henrik or Kendrick. I've come unstuck in time. About the kind of neurological aspect of it, and it almost crosses over into, when you know someone like you and I, when you've known someone for forever, you can instantly remember something you did together when you were 12. You know what I mean? And it is like we are time travelers in the way that we reckon our lives. And
something we did when we were 12 could be 2 weeks ago.
Feels
on
like
the way up here, I passed Arnside Tower, and even though you were already here and I was on my way here, we were also there.
Yes, of course we were. Yeah. And that I underlined. One of the books on Henry's shelf is Winnie the Pooh. I think it's Winnie the Pooh.
Oh, interesting.
And it made me think of House at Pooh Corner. The what? I mean, it talked about crying. The one book I just can't read. It just reduces me to a blubbering mess. Is the very end of House at Pooh Corner that I did. Somewhere out there. And there's something along similar lines in here, that somewhere out there they're in the meadow having a picnic.
Yes.
No matter what's happening with all the stuff with the miscarriage and the present, the repeated miscarriages when they're trying to conceive, and all the hardship and heartache they go through. But somewhere out there, and it's almost like that's that one moment of bliss, isn't it? And it kind of resonates throughout all time. But in case anyone does find it too problematic, I've actually rewritten this book.
Oh, right, okay.
Without the time travel element, and it doesn't require much change. But my new version is called Tim Traveller's Wife, and the main character is Tim Traveller.
Oh, right. Okay.
I'll read you the blurb. It's very similar to the blurb of the actual book. It's Tim Traveller's Wife. This is the ordinary love story of Claire and Tim Traveller, who met when Claire was 20 and Tim was 28. They were married when Claire was 22 and Tim 30. Possible and true, because Tim does not suffer from a rare condition where his genetic clock periodically resets and pulls him suddenly into his past or future. Tim and Claire's struggle to lead normal lives is intensely boring and entirely forgettable. So if any of the content of The Time Traveller's Wife is a bit too much for you, you can always read Tim Traveller's Wife instead. And just to continue in a light-hearted mood before we dwell too much on grief and death and loss. I mentioned a television show earlier called Doctor Who.
Well, I feel like we've spent so much time talking about time travel and the nature of time this time that perhaps we should do something that doesn't involve any of that. A straight up romp, drama, comedy, anything other than that.
Okay, yeah, I'll bear that in mind when we decide what book to do next. But there were certain things that I noticed in this book that I wondered if they were either nods to, maybe not, maybe that the universe just weaves these things together. But if people had read this book and been influenced by it, or even there were references in this book, like we mentioned that Henry's family are into the arts, and when he's young, he's taken to an exhibition of paintings by Toulouse-Lautrec at the Moulin Rouge, who also painted a very famous image of a man in a battered, broad-brimmed hat and a long scarf, a sort of bohemian gentleman. What was also interesting is that so that Claire knows to leave clothes out for Henry, in her future, she tells Henry the dates that he met her, so that so when he goes back to her past, he tells her those very same dates, so she knows when they're going to meet, and she knows when they'll meet for the last time. And she writes them down in a blue diary.
Oh, interesting.
And also, on the New Year's Eve party, Henry proposes a toast to world enough and time, and then right at the end, when he knows, and he always knew he was going to die on, was it New Year's Eve 2007? Oh, 2006. Yeah. Or rather, he was going to die on the 1st of January 2007, and almost at midnight as well, which seemed weirdly, if you're a time traveller and you're going to, and you're at the mercy of time, and there's something about New Year's Eve and the death of the year, and we both find New Year's Eve very melancholic.
Yes.
And this doesn't help. The fact that he knows he's going to die at midnight on New Year's Eve, and then, of course, he time travels back to the meadow and gets shot, and then when he reappears, he's dying in Claire's arms, and all he can think to say is, "World enough and time would there," which is from, in case anyone doesn't know, the poem "His Coy Mistress." Had we but world enough and time, this coyness lady were no crime. And you can interpret it sort of either way. It's on the one hand, you can see it as everything we've been talking about, just like seize life, and if you love somebody, just tell them and never ever let them go. But then it's almost, in a strange way, it reminds me of Bat Out of Hell. That idea, I'll never forgive myself if we don't go all the way tonight. Like, is Andrew Marvell just trying to get his leg over, or is he wanting to just live life to the fullest? Because, of course, the famous phrase, "But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near."
I always just thought he was trying to get his leg over.
He probably is
I've only
trying
read
to
that
get
poem
his leg
cynically.
But it does make you wonder. There's a philosopher, I can't remember who, and he said, basically, there's this idea that we as humans are always saying life is short. Oh, life is short. He said life isn't short. It's made up of hours of interminable boredom. And he said that we only think life is short when we're approaching the end of our lives and we wish for more time. And he said even if we lived for 1,000 years, we'd still want more.
Yes,
and that Henry, who is a time traveller, who has lived, he's lived officially 43 years, but as he observed, he's probably actually lived longer than that. And he knows that he will see his wife and his daughter in the future after his death, and even he, in his dying moments, wishes for more time. So we're going to move away from time travel for the next episode, are we?
Well, yes.
Oh, but hang on, we haven't talked about adaptations. We normally like to do a little segment on adaptations. Have you seen the film of The Time Traveller's Wife?
I have. I can't say it left as much of an impression as the book. I think what they did with the film was thought the book is quite long, so we'll squeeze out certain aspects of it so we can fit it into our film. And what they squeeze out is all the time travel, and just boil it down to a quirky romance story with a tragic ending, almost a little bit like Tim Traveller.
Well, there was a film with Dom. No, I forgot the actor's name. It was called About Time.
Oh,
It's like
yes.
and that looked like
it has
sort
the
of
same
quirky British.
actor in
Yeah,
as Claire.
it was really confusing.
Yes.
And also, the film came out around the same time as Benjamin Button.
Yes.
Which was actually, again, they're very different, but they both tell an odd sort of chronologically messed up love story.
Challenged.
Yeah. And I really liked The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, but I didn't like the Time Traveller's Wife film at all, I'm afraid. So, but I don't remember what I disliked about it, because I don't remember anything about it. Sometimes I forget that it was even made. But like you say, I think the problem was trying to squeeze it into a film. If only someone would make a television series of it.
If only that someone who was going to make a television series was experienced, nay, maybe even a dab hand at writing paradoxical time travel type stories, and have maybe spent a large percentage of their career making such things. Who do you think would be good for that?
Who indeed?
In case you haven't twigged, we're talking about the forthcoming HBO adaptation of The Time Traveller's Wife, written by Stephen Moffat, who famously wrote the Time Traveller's Wife-inspired Doctor Who episode, The Girl in the Fireplace, during Russell T Davies' era as showrunner. And surely anything will be better than the film.
One thing that I can't forgive the film for is its soundtrack. Now, I don't remember anything about the soundtrack. It's not so that it had a bad soundtrack. It was the omission of a certain song on the soundtrack. And there was no reason for that song to be included, but in my heart, and I think your heart as well, around the time we were reading this, there was a particular song that became the unofficial, or as far as I'm concerned, official anthem, the soundtrack to The Time Traveller's Wife. I think this is going to be something that a regular section in these podcasts where we talk about the soundtrack to books that may or may not have actually have anything to do with the books themselves, but music that we just find so inexorably linked to the story and the characters. And for me, in the case of The Time Traveller's Wife, it's Stirb nicht vor mir by Rammstein.
Ah, interesting.
I don't know if you remember, there was a period where we were discussing how it was the perfect song.
Yes.
And in my head, I'd wrote, directed and scored the Time Traveller's Wife movie in my head, and at every key moment, especially the ending when Claire's 82, and especially the scene in Alba's future where she's rushing to the museum to meet him, I can't, and especially rereading, I had to pause just to put this song on to hear those opening guitar notes. Now, you might not be familiar with Rammstein, and even if you are, you might be surprised by me saying that the title in English means "Don't Die Before I Do."
And you couldn't really get much more appropriate than that.
You absolutely couldn't. And it's strange because Rammstein, I'm not convinced that the song isn't actually about murder or cannibalism.
As 90% of their songs are.
Yeah.
The other 10% are about sex.
I don't know what it's about, but it seems to be genuinely and sincerely a love song.
It's a bit of a surprise in their canon,
Massive
actually.
surprise.
I mean, they are known for having a song called Pussy.
Yeah, that's a terrible song.
Oh,
but
yes.
Mind Tile, that's the
Yes,
German
that's about
cannibalism.
the counterpart.
Yeah, that's the prequel.
Yes.
But so half of it's in German, but there's also a guest vocalist on. And is it? I forget her name.
Charlene Spiteri
From Texas.
Texas.
Tesco. Charlene from Tesco came down and did some vocals on it.
Given the city we're in, that's probably quite appropriate. Because I think she's from Glasgow, although please,
I
Texas
thought
fans,
she was from
correct me if
Texas.
I'm wrong. She's definitely not from Texas. She's Scottish.
But and again, the fact that it's a male and female duet, it just lends it to this kind of this love story element. Not that love stories have to be between men and women, but in the case of Henry and Claire. And I recently Googled, so she sings parts that are in English, and she sings the line "Don't die before I do," and that just pierces me. It just absolutely. But I recently Googled the translation of the German verse that Till sings. He's called Till, isn't he?
Till Lindemann.
Yeah. I don't know how accurate this translation is, but again, it just screamed Time Traveller's Wife. The night opens her lap. The child's name is loneliness. It is cold and motionless. I cry softly into time. I don't know what your name is, but I know that you exist. And I know that sometime someone will love me.
You know, that song I think came out in 2005.
5, yeah, almost,
and you almost
when this book was
wonder
if they'd read it.
Yes,
yeah,
yeah.
And even the other vocal part where she sings, "I don't know who you are, I know that you exist. Sometime love seems so far. I wait here, your love I can't dismiss. And it just screams, you know, especially when Claire's young and she doesn't know Henry's name, doesn't know his surname, and at times she wonders if he's her imaginary friend or if he's real, or if it's, you know, but just that belief, that faith in true love, that I believe that you exist and you are out there and one day you will hold me, and I had to share that with the world. Go and listen to Sturbnik vor mir by Rammstein. I'm probably not pronouncing the title very well. My German isn't great. It's on the album Rosenrot, and honestly, I can't. There have been many evenings where I've sort of cried myself to the point of death, listening to that song on repeat and just thinking of Henry and Claire. It is the time traveller's wife's song, even though it may or may not be about cannibalism, but
or vampires,
or vampires.
But any Rammstein fans that might have picked up on this and be listening to it. If you've got this far, without mentioning Rammstein, well done for making it through this far. But does anybody know the origin of that song? Please tweet into us. Our Twitter handle is
book at breakfast.
Excellent. So twitter.com, a book at breakfast. Whilst we're talking,
I don't think anyone goes on twitter.com anymore. I think it's an app these days. Okay. I apologise on behalf of my friend. He's just time travelled here from 2008. Twitter's this new thing.
It only seems right to stick with the time travel theme. So, next month, we will be discussing the novelisation of Rose by the wonderful Russell T Davies.
Fire up the helmet regulator.